Thank you very much. Yeah, the title on the program is longer, but this is quick and essential. Demographic trends and population genetics are strictly intertwined. In a conventional population, the pace of growth reflects fertility, mortality, and on a local level, incoming and outgoing migrations. These drivers determine population size and characteristics. But among a population defined by cultural, religious, or otherwise symbolic parameters like Jews or other groups, one additional factor of demographic change is the propensity to join or to leave, to affiliate or disaffiliate, reflecting the relative power of attraction of the given group vis-a-vis other existing and competing groups. Both in worldwide and in more circumscribed geographical perspective, Jewish populations have been growing or declining following these same paths. Now, I would like to discuss a number of central issues in Jewish population, which are somewhat pertinent to this debate. First of all, the question of the growth of the Jews that has been discussed today by several of the speakers. Let's look at some population estimates in terms of some of the major regions in the world and long span of time. Of course, the precision of these figures can be debated, but we have enough confidence that the orders of magnitude are fair. For instance, Benjamin of Tudela, after some revision, would be corresponding to a Jewish population worldwide of about 1,200,000. And then, as you see, the Jewish population does not change very much. In fact, there are short-term ups and downs, but there is a steady process of growth that brings from 1 million in 1700 to 16.5 million on the eve of World War II, then the Shoah, and then some recovery, partial so far, down to the latest estimate of more than 14 million in 2015. What has been extraordinarily different has been the geography. As was mentioned today, most of the Jews live in what here is called Africa, Asia, including Palestine or Israel. In fact, it's the Islamic world at the time of the Middle Age. And then the numbers actually declined, and we see on the other hand the growth of first Western Europe and then Eastern Europe. And Eastern Europe is quite extraordinary. It gets to nearly 8 million on the eve of the Shoah, and then after World War II it declines very dramatically, much of this because of Shoah and this because of international migration. So what has been, in fact, happening has been the transition from a world Jewry that was overwhelmingly situated in these regions until here. You see that Europe is less than half of the total by the time of the expulsion from Spain. And then Eastern Europe, out of total, which was initially quite small and marginal, becomes very dominant, and then it declines. And finally, Palestine, which was nearly non-existent, has now grown to nearly 44% of the total world Jewish population. Now, the question is this growth plausible? And this was the question asked, and it has attracted so many different discussions and solutions. And what, as a demographer, I'm here to do is to show the plausibility of the demographic exercise. I'm not assuring that this is exactly what happened, but the question is whether a population, and here we are talking of Eastern Europe, that was just a population of a few thousands, assuming that Benjamin of Tudela, just to give one example, is a source that speaks of a very tiny population. It mentions 2 or 3 places. We didn't visit those places, but clearly the Jewish population at the time was small, and later sources still speak of just a few thousands and a few tens of thousands of Jews, and then we have the enormous growth to the point that if we assume there were about 50,000 Jews or maybe 25,000 in the beginning of the 14th century, on the beginning, at the end of the 19th century and the beginning of the 20th, also factoring in the immigration from Eastern Europe towards the Americas and other overseas countries, there were more than 8.5 million. Is this possible demographically? It is somewhat like the question, could the 70 Israelites who went down to Egypt came out as 600,000 Jews after 430 years? By the way, the answer is definitely yes, just by working with this technology. So these are the that the yearly growth rates implicit in those numerical rates, these are the numbers of years, and the input that the demographer can bring is population models called model life tables, which were developed mostly during the 1960s and have been refined in recent years, especially to factor in the enhanced longevity at very old age, but this is not of principal interest here. By which any combination of a life expectancy and the total fertility rate creates a certain rate of growth, a certain annual rate of growth. Now, we are basically doing some exercise in reverse engineering because we have the rate of growth, and what we are looking for is the appropriate combination of a mortality and a fertility rate that might produce that same population growth. And in fact, we have that. And the question is whether the assumptions are reasonable or impossible, and I will argue that they are fairly reasonable. For the first part, they are purely conjectural, but then for the second part, for the later part, starting basically during the early 19th century and throughout the end of the 19th century and the beginning of the 20th century, these are actual empirical data, that is, they actually show their validity. You just need an average life expectancy of 25, which is really pretty low, and it is found in several European populations at that time, and a total fertility which is just below 6. It is not that 6 children are born to every woman, but that the rate of growth, the fertility rate at the ages when a person is still alive would produce such a fertility rate. So two figures which are definitely possible at this historical conjuncture would produce that very moderate rate of 0.3 to 0.4% a year, which would simply produce the doubling from 25 to 50,000 over that span of time. Then we see that the rate of growth tends to become much faster, and this is obtained just by relatively minor improvements in life expectancy. We do not much rely on the total fertility, which remains at levels which are slightly below 6, and then start declining to between 5 and 6. And just by a life expectancy of 45 on average, which has been recently found in very underdeveloped societies in the 20th century, but that was the situation in Eastern Europe, you neatly reach such a quite spectacular rate of 1.7 and even 2% a year, which do contribute to the doubling or trebling of the Jewish population in Eastern Europe and its derivatives, including those who migrated to overseas. So this is just to say that the demographer does not need strange cases of massive conversion. It does not need immigration from unknown continents and unknown planets and countries. It is simply by looking at what could be plausible under known conditions, and this is the second part, and under speculative but reasonable conditions in the first part, to bridge between those few thousands in the beginning and the huge masses that constituted really the backbone of world Jewry at the end of the 19th century. One of the mechanisms that has been very much discussed here and is very central to Jewish demography is the fact that the growth of population is highly differential. There are segments that grow very fast and segments that don't. This is true in terms of the geography. We have seen that. That is, most of the growth of world Jewry happened, in fact, in Eastern Europe. The growth in the Muslim countries was relatively slow, and so it was also in the Western European societies for a variety of reasons, not excluding also conversion of Jews, but also much lower fertility rates, perhaps slightly better mortality in certain periods, but certainly a lower fertility. But the differential growth is important internationally and locally. And here I would like to provide a demonstration which uses a very simple measure. It's called the parity progression ratio. Parity progression ratio says what's the measured likelihood that a person with a given number of children will have the next child. So this is the proportion of women who have no children, who will have the transition to one child, and from 1 to 2, and from 5 to 6, and from 7 to 8. And these are the percentages how, in fact, actually measured in a selection of actual populations in Israel, and then also in the state of Israel, looking at observations conducted among women born between 1860 and 1938, observed in 1930 to 1983. And as you see graphically, it is very differentiated. Let's start from this. This is an observation of Jewish women in Carpathia, that is the most easternmost province of Czechoslovakia, of former Czechoslovakia, born around and before 1860, and then 1860, and then born after 1890. As you see, here you have a nearly unrestrained fertility. That is, a woman who has a child has 95% probability of having a second child, and a woman who has 4 children has a 95% probability of having the 5th. And still a woman who has 6 has a 90% probability of having the 7th. And so you say this is, of course, a population which is growing very fast, of course, considering that there is also mortality and ignoring for the moment international migration. The same population revisited with a somewhat younger cohort, that would be this line, has in fact somewhat reduced fertility, but it is continuing to have high rates of transition, and in fact at parity 7, the proportion of those who will be the 8th is just below 60%, which is still a respectable data. This is one pattern, high and nearly unrestrained fertility. But let's look at a different pattern, and this is the pattern that we have for France in the among women born before 1910. Here you see a very interesting feature. The decline after the 1st and the 2nd and the 3rd, but those who will have the 4th, then the probability of having the 5th raises very much. This means that the public is split between 2 subpopulations, one that tends to have fewer children, and the minority that, having had those that already were born, will continue significantly to have more. Even more interesting are these observations about early cohorts in the state of Israel, including all origins, where after a definite decline around the 3rd and 4th parity, there is a definite increase around the 6th and 7th, which again means that one part of the public will stop after, say, the 2nd, 3rd, or maybe the 4th child, and another part of the public will continue having the 6th, 7th, and 8th child, and therefore the rate of growth of these different subpopulations will be very different within the same country. Without continuing this, we can just present the contemporary Israeli case, which of course is very important in terms of the global consideration of contemporary Jewish demography. These are parity transitions observed in 2005, and here there is a refinement. One line, the bottom line, by the way, for men and for women, in the darker line, women actual, and in the lighter line, men actual. By the way, as you see, women have somewhat higher parity transition rate than men. It shows that women want to have more children, and then considering divorces and remarriages, in fact, they do have more children than men. The difference is not big, but it is interesting. So these are the actual transition, parity transitions of women, and these are the intended number of children that we investigated in a big survey in 2005, by which we say, first of all, there is still a gap, and this is the gap that whether accomplished or not will provide the final indicator of whatever Israel demography will be. This is not really pertinent to this discussion, but it is an interesting indicator in terms of social policies and considering the economy of fertility and the services and social conditions that accompany the process. All of this is a project. Whether the project will be accomplished or not is an interesting question. But here you see again that having experienced a tendency to decline, that is stoppage after a certain number of children, there is still a part of the public that will tend to have more children. And now this is demonstrated in a way which is much more striking in the next slide. This classifies the Israeli population by different levels of religiosity, from the extreme end of very secular to intermediate to the extreme end of very religious. And these are, again, two measures. The lower line is the number of children already born. We are talking of a sample of men and women, Jewish, married in stable unions, who are all below the age of 50, and 45 for women and 50 for men. So theoretically, they still, part of the sample still has the possibility to add more children. And these are the declarations of the ideally expected number of children finally in the family. Now, this is perhaps an exaggeration. Look as on the more extreme religiosity side, the ideal average final parity would be in the range of 9 for the highest religious group. The actual number will probably be closer to something between 6 and 7. They already have between 4 and 5. And no less interesting is the fact that at the lowest level of religiosity, they already accomplished is 2 children, but they would like to plan something in the vicinity of 3, which is exceptionally high for a developed country, especially considering that we are talking of the most secular segment of society. But the implications in terms of differential population growth are quite evident, because some will eventually grow more rapidly than others, and this in the end, and cumulated for several generations, will have an obvious effect in terms of not only size, but also composition of the total population we are talking about. The next mechanism is what I call the end of Jewish, non-Jewish dichotomy. In the past, we were raised and educated thinking that the world is neatly divided in 2 parts, Jews and non-Jews. Well, the sociology and the demography of the last generations show that the reality is a little bit more complex. In fact, first of all, let's have a quick look at how the pie of contemporary Jewish populations defined in a somewhat restrictive way, which I will illustrate in a moment, is. These are about 14,400,000 Jews worldwide, estimated at the beginning of 2016. Here you have the 2 big segments, Israeli society and the Jews in the United States. The 2 major components include about slightly less than 85% of the total Jewish population worldwide. And the rest is very much subdivided between about 95 countries, of which I represent here about the 18 largest. And then there are another about 200,000 Jews who are part of smaller Jewish communities of less than 18,000 persons each. You see France, Canada, UK, Argentina. Most of these are Western and developed countries. Some of them are the remnants of the former Soviet Union, and countries in Latin America and smaller communities, most of them in the West. So this being the general geographical picture, we have to take into account that the pace of integration and, as we say sometimes, the mixture between Jews and others has increased very much. The example provided here is the percentage of Jews marrying with non-Jewish partners during the 20th century and the beginning of the 21st, starting in the first decade of the 20th century at a level of basically 1%, based on surveys and studies done at the time, then growing slowly until basically the mid-1950s, when the rate of intermarriage of Jews in the US still was barely 5%, very low in comparison with what we have in many Western societies, especially in Europe. Then we have a very rapid takeoff that goes up and reaches the 40% around the 1980s, and then passes 50% and reaches about 58% according to the latest Pew survey in 2013. Now, interestingly, in parentheses, I would add that the assumption that the size of the community can be correlated to the frequency of intermarriage doesn't work anymore, because the US Jewry are by far the largest Jewish community in the diaspora, whereas the proportion of intermarriage in the US is indeed lower than in the Russian Republic, just to quote a number of examples, but it is far higher than in countries like France, Canada, Mexico, and now we have just these days a new monograph published about the United Kingdom that puts the rate of intermarriage at about 1/2 the level of Jews in the United States. So intermarriage is very diffused, and this creates very significant effects in terms of defining the Jewish population, which is what I'm going to do now. The data that I have displayed refer to a concept that I call the core Jewish population, in Hebrew, Oklusiat Liba, and it assumes that a person can be Jewish, and being Jewish is mutually exclusive with being something else. This is a concept that, of course, has to be taken as a definition. There are other definitions, as we see immediately in this diagram. So this kind of mutually exclusive concept, being Jewish only, can then be subdivided among those who say Jewish only and Judaism is my religion, or I'm Jewish only and I have no religion or no interest in religion, but yet I'm not something else. So the sum of these two categories creates the core Jewish population, which is the one I portrayed in my pie moments ago. But then we have several other options. People who say, and these are survey data, I am partly Jewish. That is, I'm Jewish and Protestant. I have two religions. Or I'm Jewish and Chinese, and I feel significant contact and responsibility vis-a-vis both of these communities. I cannot say I prefer only one of these. So these are people who are partly Jewish. They have generally one Jewish parent. They are the issue of intermarriage. There are other people who say, I'm Jewish connected, not Jewish, but I may have a Jewish parent. I was raised something else, although I have a Jewish parent. So the total of core is known. Then you have those who have a Jewish parent, those who say I'm partly Jewish, and those who say I'm not Jewish. Then you have the concept of the enlarged Jewish population, which also includes all of the non-Jewish members in the Jewish households, because there are, of course, intermarriages and they participate in daily life. And finally, you have the law of return concept, which incorporates 3 generations and the laterals, who are all entitled to come to Israel and receive Israeli citizenship. Interestingly, if this is about 14.5 million, at the second circle, you may add another 3 million people by estimates. In this circle, you may add further 3 million people, and by the law of return, you can add 3 further million people. So at least the gap between the core and the law of return is about 9 million. But this says and shows very clearly how it is today nearly impossible to give one figure, one and only figure to define how many Jews, and therefore what are the boundaries of a community which is relevant for medical or other research. Is highly fluid, and depending on your criteria, you will include or exclude certain persons. And the last comment concerns the future of the Jews and its relation to studies in population genetics. This is again a reproduction of the very rapid rate of Jewish intermarriage in the US, but with the red line, Jews marrying non-Jews in the US. And this is a measure of the rate of intermarriage between Jews of different continental origins in Israeli society. I've created a rather arbitrary dichotomy between Asia and Africa vis-a-vis Europe and America. I'm the first to acknowledge that this is a very rude and imperfect way of characterizing Israeli society. But if we wish to do the exercise, the interesting thing is that we get a process which is very similar to what we have in the States, meaning that under conditions of openness, when there are no institutional barriers which prevent meeting and eventually marriage, the process has a certain dynamics, and the dynamics brings eventually to the majority out marrying. The projection of these data, if we wish to look at the future, and without looking, in fact, at the internal composition of these groups, is that while Jews in the US tend to be rather stable from now to 2050, the Jewish population in Israel, of course, under current conditions and without thinking of imaginary scenarios of enormous changes in the region and in world society, it tends to grow significantly and tends to become the majority of Jewish population worldwide, whereas in the rest of the country, population remains quite static. Of course, the big challenge for those who will do population genetics is that both in terms of what happens in Israel, the classic subdivision between countries of origin, edot, becomes more and more complex to verify and ascertain. And in terms of what happens out of Israel, especially in the US, but also in the smaller communities, incorporates a growing proportion of non-Jews. And therefore, the challenge of Jewish demography from the substantive point of view will also become the challenge of Jewish population dynamics for the processes that I have outlined. Thank you.
Questions, please? Yes.
I thought your data on the history of Eastern European Jews early on was extremely interesting. I wonder whether you have any data about the Jews in England until the time of the expulsion in 1290.
Well, as you realize, my work here is rather of the macro kind and not so much of the micro. This can be done. It can be done, but then it becomes certainly more prone to error. You have then to do something very punctual based on the population history of each specific locality and then personal history and family history. This is done usually by historians. My task today was rather to produce a broad synthesis. It's a generalization, but I think it helps in terms of the plausibility of certain theses.
Not just now. Thank you.
Thank you very much.